My dad broke into my apartment at 3 a.m., deleted my research, and said I was planning to abandon the family. When I tried to stand up for myself, he pressed his face against the door and whispered, "You've been looking into things you shouldn't." I stayed silent. That was 4 months ago. This morning, he was sitting in a therapist's office, holding a candle, and asking if Michael could hear him. In my family, we had something called Foundation Day every year on March 22nd. It wasn't like other family traditions with photo albums and fond memories. At exactly 6 p.m., we'd all go down to the basement. No lights, no electricity, just one candle. According to Dad, it was the day our ancestors founded our family homestead after surviving a brutal winter in 1874. We honored them by recreating their hardship. Dad said our ancestors huddled in caves for warmth, so we huddled on moldy wool blankets in our basement for 18 hours straight, until noon the next day. I hated every second of it. The rules were brutal. Nobody could leave the circle. We ate cold beans from cans and shared one jug of water. If you needed the bathroom, you held it. Dad said our ancestors didn't have luxuries like plumbing when they were founding our family legacy. My sister Emma always cried, but Dad would stroke her hair and tell her she was honoring great-great-grandma Marsh, who lost 3 toes to frostbite. As a kid, I was terrified. I'd sob the whole time. But Dad said that was the point. You had to feel fear to appreciate being alive. Every year, he told the same stories. How the Marsh family survived when others didn't. How they stayed together in the darkness and emerged stronger. He'd count out loud sometimes. 14, 15, 16. Said it was the hours they spent in their final shelter before spring came. When I got older, I started questioning it. Why did we do this? Why were we celebrating our ancestors in such a bizarre way? I remember once, at 15, my friend Jake invited me to his family reunion, and I mentioned I couldn't go because it was almost Foundation Day. When I explained our basement ritual, his face went pale. "Dude, that's seriously messed up," he said. That night, I couldn't sleep. Jake's reaction played on a loop in my head. That's when I started noticing things. How Mom's hands shook when she packed the beans. How our family had 0 photos or documents about these supposed ancestors. When I asked to see family records for a school project, Dad got angry. Said I was disrespecting our heritage, but there was fear in his eyes. Real terror. Like I'd threatened to burn the house down. The worst part was watching Dad during Foundation Day. Normal Dad joked around and watched football. Foundation Day. Dad sat rigid in the darkness, whispering to the walls. His breathing would get shallow and he'd clutch the candle like it might disappear. Once I heard him say, "I'm sorry," over and over, until his voice went hoarse. Senior year, I tried to skip it. Told them I had SAT prep that couldn't be rescheduled. Dad completely lost it, grabbed my shoulders and shook me. "You don't understand what happens if we break the chain," he said. His eyes looked terrified. 18 hours. That's what we owe. That's what I owe. Mom pulled him off me, but I could see she was crying. Not angry tears, scared tears, the kind that made my stomach drop. I went down to the basement anyway because Dad looked so broken. Still, the obsession haunted me. Who were these Marsh ancestors really? Why all the secrecy? Last year, I got the courage to do real research. I went to the library and searched genealogy records. Nothing about a Marsh family founding anything in 1874. Nothing about cave survivors. I was about to give up when I tried searching newspaper archives instead. That's when I found it. March 22nd, 1994. Boy rescued. After 18 hours, trapped in collapsed parking garage. I felt like the floor dropped out from under me. The boy was Timothy Marsh, my dad, 6 years old. The article said he'd been playing with his twin brother when the structure collapsed. He survived in an air pocket. They found him after exactly 18 hours. Dehydrated, hypothermic, but alive. There were other details in the article. I took photos with my phone, hands shaking. That night, I read through everything I'd captured. The rescue worker said it was a miracle. Air pockets that small usually run out of oxygen within hours. His twin brother Michael was found too. He'd been dead for hours. It all clicked. There were no founding ancestors. The Marsh family weren't pioneers. They were my dad and his dead twin. Foundation Day wasn't about honoring heritage. It was about the day my dad was pulled from the rubble. The beans? What a starving child dreams of. The basement? His collapsed concrete tomb. The photo? I bet if I looked closer, I'd see 2 little boys, not pioneers. But the final line of the article made my blood run cold. The rescue worker mentioned that when they found my dad, he was talking to someone who wasn't there, making promises, and he'd been counting. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 18, over and over. I sat in my apartment staring at that newspaper photo on my phone. 2 weeks. Foundation Day was in 2 weeks. My hands trembled as I zoomed in on the grainy image of 6-year-old Timothy Marsh being pulled from the rubble. The rescue worker's face showed relief mixed with horror. Behind him, I could make out a small covered stretcher. My phone buzzed. Dad. The text made my stomach clench. Getting preparations ready for Foundation Day. You coming home to help? I didn't respond. Couldn't. My mind raced through 30 years of basement rituals, of Dad whispering apologies to empty corners, of counting that never stopped. 18 hours. Always 18 hours. The knock came at 3 a.m. I jolted awake on my couch, the newspaper article still glowing on my laptop screen. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Through the peephole, I saw Dad. His eyes looked wild, darting back and forth like he was being chased. I cracked the door open, keeping the chain on. His hair stuck up at odd angles and his shirt was inside out. He pressed his face close to the gap. "You've been looking into things you shouldn't." My blood went cold. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Dad, it's 3 in the morning. The librarian called me." His words came out in a rush. "Mrs. Henderson, we went to high school together. She said you were in there asking about the Marsh family, looking at old newspapers." The chain stretched taut as he pushed against the door. I'd forgotten how small our town was, how everyone knew everyone. Of course the librarian would know Dad. Of course she'd mention his kid digging through archives. My phone started ringing. Emma's name lit up the screen. At 3:15 a.m., Dad's eyes tracked to the phone. "Answer it." I grabbed the phone with shaking hands. Emma was crying, her words coming out in hiccups. Dad had shown up at her apartment 20 minutes ago, pounding on her door, demanding to know if I'd talk to her about family business. Her roommate had threatened to call the police before he finally left. "Emma, I'm so sorry," I managed to say while Dad watched through the door crack. "What's going on?" She sobbed harder. "He kept asking about Foundation Day, if you'd said anything about changing things." He looked crazy. Dad pushed harder against the door. "Let me in. We need to talk as a family." After I got Emma calmed down and promised to call her in the morning, Dad finally left, but something felt wrong. I walked through my apartment, checking windows, looking in closets. Nothing seemed out of place until I went to grab my keys from the kitchen counter. They weren't where I'd left them. I found them on the coffee table, right next to my laptop. The newspaper photo was gone from my phone. Not just closed, deleted from my photo library entirely. My laptop browser history had been cleared. He had a key. Of course he had a key. He'd insisted on having one for emergencies when I'd moved in 2 years ago. The text from Mom came at 6 a.m. Please come home. Your father hasn't slept in 3 days. He keeps talking about protecting the family. I'm scared. I drove home in a daze. The house looked normal from the outside. Same faded blue siding, same crooked mailbox. But Dad's car was parked at an angle across the lawn, like he'd been in too much of a hurry to use the driveway. I found him in the basement. He sat in the exact spot where we always did foundation day, cross-legged on the moldy blankets. In broad daylight, I could see things I'd never noticed during our candlelit rituals. Scratch marks on the concrete walls, dozens of tally marks carved into the floor, all in groups of 18. He was talking to the corner, his voice soft and urgent. I know, but they're trying to stop it. They don't understand what I promised. Dad? He turned slowly, his face lighting up with an expression that made my skin crawl. Not anger, relief. Michael says you're going to ruin everything. The name hit me like a physical blow. Michael, his twin brother, dead for 30 years, but apparently still holding conversations in our basement. Mom appeared at the top of the stairs, gesturing frantically for me to come up. I backed away slowly, not wanting to turn my back on Dad. He'd already returned to his conversation with the corner. In the kitchen, Mom's hands shook as she poured coffee. Dark circles ringed her eyes. She looked like she'd aged 5 years in the week since I'd last seen her. How long has he been like this? I asked. She glanced toward the basement door. It gets worse every year. After each foundation day, She stopped, pressing her lips together. You what? I crushed sleeping pills in his food for about a week after. It's the only way to get him to rest. The confession came out in a whisper. Otherwise, he stays awake, counting, always counting to 18. Mom, I know what it is. Her voice turned sharp. You think I don't know? But what am I supposed to do? He's my husband, Emma's father, your father. Emma arrived an hour later, looking as exhausted as the rest of us. Dad had called her 14 times since leaving her apartment. She showed me the voicemails, his voice getting progressively more agitated, talking about family loyalty and keeping promises. He made me promise, Emma said quietly while Mom was in the bathroom. Last year, after foundation day, what's really going on with Dad's counting and these basement conversations? I'm curious why he needs everyone else there if this is about his personal trauma. Seems like there's something deeper he's not saying about those 18 hours in the rubble. He pulled me aside and made me swear that if anything happened to him, I'd keep doing it. Keep the tradition alive. Emma, you can't. I know. She wiped at her eyes. But you didn't see his face. He looked so desperate. He said Michael was counting on us. I thought about the newspaper article about 6-year-old Timothy talking to his dead brother while rescuers dug him out, making promises to someone who could no longer hear them. That afternoon, while Mom kept Dad occupied, I searched his study. I knew I was violating his privacy, but I needed answers. In the bottom drawer of his desk, hidden under tax returns, I found it. A leather journal, its pages filled with Dad's cramped handwriting. But these weren't normal journal entries. They were conversations, full dialogues between Dad and Michael, dated all the way up to last week. Michael, they're going to try to stop you. Me, I won't let them. Michael, you promised. 18 hours. Me, every year. I haven't forgotten. Michael, it's getting harder to breathe down here. Me, I know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Page after page of apologies, promises, and increasingly frantic reassurances that the ritual would continue. The most recent entry made my hands shake. Michael says he can see them planning, says they want to abandon us, but I won't let that happen. 18 hours. That's what I owe. That's what we owe. He protected me for 18 hours in that pocket of air, keeping me calm, telling me stories. Now I protect him. The journal slipped from my hands as Dad's voice came from behind me. He protected me for 18 hours. I protect him forever. He stood in the doorway, calm now. The wild look had faded, replaced by something worse. Absolute certainty. Dad, Michael is, don't. He held up a hand. Don't you dare say it. You weren't there. You don't know what those 18 hours were like. What he did for me. He was 6 years old, Dad, just like you. He kept me alive. Dad's voice broke. In that darkness, when the air was running out, he kept talking, kept me focused, made me promise to remember him, to honor those 18 hours. He walked to his desk, picked up the journal. Every foundation day, he comes back. I can feel him in that basement, waiting. The same corner where we huddled in the collapse. The same darkness. The same fear. Dad, you need help. Number. He clutched the journal to his chest. What I need is my family. Together. Like always. The next few days blurred together. Dad started showing up at my workplace, telling my coworkers I was having mental health struggles and needed family support. My boss pulled me aside, concerned, suggesting maybe I should take some time off to deal with family issues. I reread old texts from Dad with new eyes. Messages I'd thought were just typical parent stuff took on darker meanings. Family is everything. Some bonds can't be broken. You'll understand when you have kids of your own. Threats disguised as love. He was working on Emma too, calling her constantly, reminding her of every time I'd let her down as a sibling, how I'd missed her college graduation because of work, how I'd forgotten her birthday 2 years ago, building a case that I was selfish, unstable, someone who would destroy the family. Maybe he's right, Emma said during one of our secret coffee meetings. Maybe you should just let this go. It's one day a year. Emma, he's sick. He needs professional help. He's processing trauma his way, she repeated, and I recognized the words. The family doctor, Dad's childhood friend, had said the same thing when I'd tried to voice my concerns at my last checkup. I started noticing Dad everywhere. His car in the parking lot when I left work. A glimpse of him in the grocery store aisle. One night, coming home late from a friend's house, I found him in my apartment building's basement, just standing there in the dark. The basement here reminds me of home, he said when I found him. Same smell, same feeling. That's when Jake reached out. We hadn't talked in years, but he'd heard through the small town grapevine that I was having family problems. My therapist says what you described back in high school sounds like serious abuse, he told me over coffee. The isolation, the rituals, the fear, that's not normal family tradition. I wanted to cry with relief. Someone else saw it. Someone else understood. Mom agreed to to meet me at a diner on the edge of town, where Dad wouldn't think to look for us. She looked even worse than before, her cardigan hanging loose on her frame. "I can't abandon him," she said before I could speak. "He's sick, I know that, but he's my husband. Mom, he needs professional help, real help." She rolled up her sleeve, revealing bruises in the shape of fingerprints. "He grabbed me when I suggested we skip foundation day this year. Not to hurt me. He was terrified, kept saying Michael would be angry. Then we need to. No police." She pulled her sleeve down. "No authorities. You don't understand what this town is like. Everyone knows everyone. They all think he's just quirky, devoted to family tradition." I showed Emma the newspaper article that night. Her face went pale as she read about the collapse, about Michael, about the 18 hours. "Oh my God," she whispered. "All those stories about ancestors. All lies. Or delusions. I don't know which is worse." She looked up at me, tears streaming. "We can't do this anymore. We can't go down to that basement and pretend we're honoring some family legacy when really we're, what? Reenacting his trauma?" "No," I agreed. "We can't." That's when the text came through to both our phones simultaneously. "Foundation day is in 1 week. Attendance is not optional." Dad's message hung between Emma and me like a physical threat. We sat in my apartment, both staring at our phones, neither speaking for several long minutes. Emma's hands trembled as she set her phone face down on the coffee table. The next morning, Dad appeared at Emma's workplace. Her manager later described how Dad had stood in the lobby for 20 minutes, explaining to anyone who would listen that his daughter was going through a difficult time and needed family support. He mentioned my concerning behavior and how I was trying to turn Emma against her own family. By lunch, 3 of Emma's coworkers had pulled her aside to ask if she was okay, if she needed help dealing with her troubled sibling. Emma called me from her car, voice shaking with anger and humiliation. Dad had effectively painted her as a victim, and me as the aggressor. The manipulation was surgical in its precision. That evening, I discovered Dad had been busier than I'd realized. My landlord knocked on my door, explaining that my father had stopped by to express concerns about my mental state. Dad had suggested, ever so helpfully, that perhaps the landlord should keep an eye on me, maybe check in more frequently. The landlord, a kind elderly man who'd known Dad for years, promised he would. I recognized the pattern from psychology textbooks I'd been frantically reading. Isolation, discrediting, creating a narrative where I was the problem, not him. Classic manipulation tactics employed by someone desperate to maintain control. Mom's sister called me the next day. She'd noticed Dad counting under his breath at Sunday dinner, his lips moving silently as he carved the roast. 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, over and over. When she'd asked if he was feeling all right, he'd snapped at her with such venom that her husband had stood up from the table. The construction site where the parking garage had collapsed was only 40 minutes from our house. I drove there on Tuesday morning, needing to see the place where it all began. A strip mall stood there now, unremarkable and bland. But in the back corner of the parking lot, I found a small memorial plaque I'd never known existed. In memory of those lost in the Riverside parking garage collapse, March 22nd, 1994. Michael Marsh's name was third on the list. As I stood there, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. When I opened it, my blood ran cold. It was a photo of me, standing at the memorial, taken from maybe 50 feet away. The message below read, "Dad thought you might come here." I spun around, scanning the parking lot, but saw no one. Another text arrived. This time it was a screenshot of my recent Google searches about trauma, PTSD, and involuntary commitment procedures. My laptop. Dad still had access to my apartment. I changed my locks that afternoon, but the damage was done. Dad had been monitoring me, building his case. Every search I'd made, every article I'd read about helping someone with trauma-induced delusions, he knew it all. Emma met me at a park the next day, choosing a bench in the middle of an open field where we could see anyone approaching. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes matching Mom's. She pulled out her phone and showed me a series of texts from Dad, each one more manipulative than the last. He reminded her of when I'd missed her high school graduation, of the Christmas I'd spent with a girlfriend's family instead of coming home, of every perceived slight and abandonment, real or imagined, stretching back decades. But the final text was the worst. "Michael says he's disappointed in you for listening to your sibling. He thought you were different. He thought you understood about family loyalty." Emma's voice cracked as she explained that Dad had never mentioned Michael to her before, not once in all their foundation day conversations. But now, suddenly, Michael had opinions about her choices. That's when I made a decision. I pulled out my phone and searched for trauma specialists in nearby cities. If our small town wouldn't help, I'd find someone who would. After 6 calls, I found Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in trauma-induced psychosis and had experience with cases involving deceased siblings. Dad's monitoring game is stronger than my phone's parental controls, screenshots of search history, memorial stalking, and suddenly Michael has opinions about Emma's loyalty. This ghost brother just became the world's pickiest supernatural life coach. Dr. Chen listened to my abbreviated explanation and agreed to an emergency consultation. She couldn't treat Dad without his consent, but she could advise us on how to handle the situation. Her first piece of advice was stark: document everything. So I started recording every interaction, every text, every voicemail. Emma did the same. Mom, when we carefully approached her about it, revealed she'd been documenting Dad's behavior for years. She showed us a hidden folder on her laptop filled with videos taken secretly on her phone. Dad talking to empty corners, Dad carving tally marks into the basement floor, Dad sitting in the dark at 3 a.m. counting. The videos spanned 5 years. In the earliest ones, Dad's conversations with Michael were occasional, mostly around Foundation Day. But each year they became more frequent, more urgent. In the most recent video, from just last month, Dad was bargaining with the empty corner, promising Michael that the family would never abandon their tradition. Mom also revealed something that made my stomach drop. She'd found sewer slide notes, plural, one for each year, all dated March 23rd, the day after Foundation Day. Dad wrote them before each ritual and threw them away after. But Mom had been secretly keeping them, hiding them in a safety deposit box Dad didn't know about. The notes all said variations of the same thing. If the ritual was ever broken, if the family ever failed to honor those 18 hours, Dad would join Michael. He couldn't bear the thought of Michael waiting alone in the dark. 3 days before Foundation Day, Dad's behavior shifted. He stopped going to work, calling in sick with a voice that sounded perfectly normal. He spent his days days preparing the basement, making it authentic. Mom watched him carry down blankets, jugs of water, cans of beans, but she also saw him bring down other things: a propane heater, several containers of gasoline, a lock for the basement door that could only be opened from the inside. When Mom confronted him about the lock, Dad's mask finally slipped completely. He grabbed her shoulders, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave new bruises, and explained with terrifying calm that the family needed to understand commitment, that Michael had been locked in the collapsed garage, unable to leave. The least they could do was experience that same helplessness. Mom called me sobbing from her car. She'd fled the house and was sitting in a grocery store parking lot, afraid to go home. That's when I knew we couldn't wait for Foundation Day. We needed to act now. I called Jake's family. His parents, both retired teachers, had dealt with troubled families before. They agreed to help however they could. Jake's mother offered their guest room to Mom, while his father reached out to a friend who was a retired crisis counselor. But when Mom went back to pack a bag, Dad was waiting. He'd been calm, she told us later, apologetic even. He explained that the stress of Foundation Day always affected him, but that everything would be better once it was over. He promised no locks on the door, promised it would be just like every other year. Mom wanted to believe him. After 30 years of marriage, she wanted to believe that the man she loved was still in there, underneath the trauma and delusion. So she stayed. Emma and I made a pact that night. No matter what happened, we wouldn't go into that basement. We'd support each other, present a united front. If Dad wanted to maintain his ritual, he'd have to do it alone. The next morning, 48 hours before Foundation Day, I woke to find Dad in my apartment. He sat in my kitchen, drinking coffee he'd made himself, looking for all the world like a normal father visiting his child. Except it was 5 a.m., and I'd changed the locks, and there were fresh scratches around the deadbolt suggesting he'd picked it. He smiled when he saw me, that same relieved expression from the basement, like everything was going according to plan. He gestured to the chair across from him, and I sat, my heart hammering. Dad explained, in a voice devoid of emotion, that he understood my concerns. He knew I'd been researching trauma and PTSD. He knew about my calls to therapists. He even knew about Mom's videos, having found her hidden folder weeks ago. But none of that mattered, he said, because Michael had explained everything. According to Dad, Michael had been visiting me too. I just didn't remember. Michael had been trying to help me understand, but outside influences, Jake, the therapists, the internet, were clouding my judgment. That's why this Foundation Day was so important. It would help me remember, help me understand why the tradition had to continue. I kept my voice steady and told Dad I loved him but wouldn't be attending Foundation Day. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, hurt, anger, before settling on something that chilled me to my core: acceptance. He stood, patted my shoulder, and said Michael had warned him this might happen, that I might be too far gone to save. But that was okay. Emma would understand. Emma would carry on the tradition. After he left, I called Emma immediately. She didn't answer. I called 6 more times before racing to her apartment. Her roommate answered the door, confused. Emma had left an hour ago, saying her dad needed help with a family emergency. I drove to my parents' house, breaking every speed limit. Dad's car was in the driveway, parked normally this time. The house looked peaceful in the morning light, but the basement door was open. I could hear voices from below, Dad's calm tone mixing with Emma's distressed one. I crept down the stairs, my phone recording everything. They sat in the ritual circle, Dad holding Emma's hands. He was explaining how Michael had chosen her, how proud he was that she understood family loyalty in a way I never could. Emma's face was streaked with tears, but she nodded along, trapped between her love for our father and her growing understanding of his illness. That's when I noticed the supplies Dad had gathered, not just the usual beans and water. The propane heater sat in the corner, unlit but ready. The gas containers lined the wall, and beside Dad, almost hidden under a blanket, was a length of chain and a padlock. I stepped into the basement, and Dad's face lit up with that horrible relief again. He announced to the corner that both his children had come home, that Michael's patience had been rewarded. Emma looked at me with desperate eyes. Dad's grip on her hands was firm, possessive. She mouthed help without making a sound. I told Dad we needed Mom here too, that if this was really about family, we should all be together. His face clouded with confusion, as if he'd forgotten Mom existed, but then he nodded, saying Michael agreed. The whole family should be here. While Dad went upstairs to find Mom, I grabbed Emma and we ran. We made it to my car before Dad realized what had happened. As I drove away, I saw him in the rearview mirror, standing in the driveway, not chasing us, but simply watching, counting on his fingers. Emma broke down completely once we were safe. She explained that Dad had been visiting her every night for the past week, sitting outside her apartment, leaving notes under her door. The notes were conversations between Michael and Dad about Emma's important role in continuing the tradition, about how she was the only one who truly understood. We drove to Jake's parents' house, where Mom was already waiting. She'd fled when Dad went to the basement, grabbing the box of sewer slide notes and videos on her way out. We sat in their living room, 3 generations of Marsh family members, finally united in accepting the truth. Dad was seriously ill and needed professional help. Jake's father, the retired crisis counselor, helped us understand our options. We could seek an emergency psychiatric hold if Dad became a danger to himself or others. The gasoline and propane heater certainly suggested that possibility, but these interventions were temporary. Long-term healing would require Dad's participation. As we discussed options, my phone rang. Dad. I almost didn't answer, but Jake's father suggested I put it on speaker so we could all hear. Dad's voice was different, younger somehow. He spoke quickly, urgently, explaining that Michael was getting impatient, that Foundation Day was tomorrow and preparations weren't complete. He needed his family home. Michael needed them home. Then, mid-sentence, his voice changed, became smaller, higher-pitched. Please come back, he said in a voice that wasn't quite his own. It's dark down here. I'm scared. Please don't leave me alone. The line went dead. Mom's face had gone white. She whispered that Dad had just sounded exactly like Michael. She'd heard recordings of Michael's voice from old home videos, and Dad had captured it perfectly. That's when we realized the full extent of Dad's break from reality. He wasn't just talking to Michael anymore. Part of him had become Michael. The 6-year-old boy who died in the dark was living inside Dad's fractured psyche, demanding recognition, demanding those 18 hours of remembrance. We called emergency services, explaining the situation as clearly as we could. The operator took our information but explained that without an immediate threat, they couldn't force intervention. Dad talking to himself, even Even imitating voices wasn't enough, so we waited, watched the hours tick by, received increasingly frantic texts from Dad that alternated between his voice and Michael's, photos of the basement, set up for Foundation Day, videos of him practicing the ritual alone, talking to empty spaces where his family should be. The construction worker Mom had mentioned called that evening. Word had gotten around town about our family situation, and he wanted to help. He'd been part of the rescue crew in 1994. He remembered that day vividly. That voice change has me wondering what's really happening in Dad's mind. Did he practice Michael's voice from those old videos Mom mentioned, or is this something deeper? The timing of him becoming Michael right when the family refuses to participate feels too convenient somehow. He told us something that reframed everything. Michael hadn't died instantly in the collapse. He'd been alive for hours, trapped in a different pocket of air from Timothy. The boys could hear each other through the rubble. Michael had kept Timothy calm, telling him stories, making him promise to remember them, making him promise to tell everyone how brave Michael had been. But as the hours passed, Michael's voice had gotten weaker. Timothy had begged him to keep talking, had promised anything if Michael would just stay awake. The rescue worker said they could hear Timothy making increasingly desperate promises through the rubble. I'll never forget you. I'll tell your stories every year. I'll make sure you're never alone in the dark again. By hour 15, Michael had stopped responding, but Timothy kept talking, kept promising, kept counting the hours until help arrived. When they finally pulled him out at hour 18, he was still talking to his brother, still making promises to someone who could no longer hear them. The rescue worker's voice broke as he explained that Timothy had fought them when they tried to take him away from the collapse site. He'd screamed that Michael was still down there, that he couldn't leave him alone. It had taken 3 adults to carry the hysterical boy to the ambulance. Now I understood. Foundation Day wasn't just about remembering trauma. It was about keeping a promise made by a terrified 6-year-old to his dying brother. A promise that had metastasized over 30 years into a dangerous delusion. As we sat with this new understanding, Mom's phone buzzed. A text from Dad, a photo of the basement, but something was different. He'd used the gasoline to write words on the concrete floor. 18 hours or forever. Below the photo was a single line of text. Michael says it's time to choose. Foundation Day would begin in 12 hours. The emergency responders arrived at dawn. 12 hours before Foundation Day was set to begin, Mom had finally convinced them that Dad's gasoline message constituted a credible threat. 2 patrol cars and an ambulance pulled up quietly, no sirens, trying to avoid escalating the situation. I watched from Jake's parents' living room window as the officers approached our house. Dad must have been watching too because he appeared on the front porch before they reached the door. He looked composed, almost serene, wearing his best shirt like he was heading to church. The lead officer spoke with him for several minutes. Even from across the street, I could see Dad's gestures. Calm, reasonable, reassuring. He nodded along, occasionally pointing toward the house as if explaining something perfectly logical. After 10 minutes, the officers started looking relaxed. One even laughed at something Dad said. Mom gripped my arm hard enough to leave marks. We both knew what was happening. Dad was doing what he'd always done, charming authority figures, making his obsession sound like harmless family tradition. The officer's body language had shifted from cautious to sympathetic. Emma started recording on her phone as Dad invited the officers inside. They followed him willingly, probably expecting to find a normal family home with a concerned father dealing with difficult adult children. We lost sight of them for 20 agonizing minutes. When they emerged, Dad was shaking hands with both officers. They walked back to their cars looking satisfied, case closed. The ambulance pulled away without a passenger. As the patrol cars left, Dad stood on the porch and looked directly at Jake's parents' house. He raised his hand in a small wave. Mom broke down completely. 30 years of marriage, of enabling, of looking the other way. It all came crashing down as she watched those police cars drive away. She'd finally found the courage to ask for help, and Dad had neutralized it with a smile and reasonable explanations. Jake's mother made Mom tea while his father called the crisis counselor friend for advice. The counselor explained what we already suspected. Without clear evidence of immediate danger, authorities were reluctant to intervene in family matters. Dad presenting as calm and rational made involuntary commitment nearly impossible. Emma kept checking her phone obsessively. Dad had been texting her every few minutes, alternating between his voice and Michael's. The messages from Michael were getting increasingly desperate, begging her to come home, saying he was scared and alone. The psychological torture was precise and relentless. I made a decision that went against every expert recommendation. If the system wouldn't help us, I'd go back and document everything myself. Get video evidence of Dad's preparation, his conversations with Michael, the gasoline and propane. Something authorities couldn't dismiss. Mom tried to stop me, but I explained that we needed proof. Real, undeniable proof that Dad was planning something dangerous. Emma insisted on coming with me, saying she couldn't let me face him alone. We compromised. She'd wait in the car with the engine running while I went inside. The house felt different when we pulled up. All the curtains were drawn, making it look abandoned despite Dad's car in the driveway. The front door stood slightly open, like an invitation, or a trap. I entered through the kitchen, phone recording everything. The house was silent except for a faint sound from below. Dad's voice, steady and rhythmic, counting. I crept toward the basement door, trying to control my breathing. The smell hit me first. Gasoline fumes, strong enough to make my eyes water. I peered down the stairs and saw flickering candlelight dancing on the walls. Dad had already started, even though Foundation Day wasn't supposed to begin for another 8 hours. He sat in the center of the ritual circle, surrounded by the supplies he'd gathered. The propane heater glowed softly in the corner. Gas cans formed a semicircle around him, but what made my blood freeze was the chain. One end locked around his ankle, the other secured to a support beam. Dad wasn't just prepared to keep us in the basement. He'd made sure he couldn't leave. He must have heard me because his counting stopped. Without turning around, he spoke in that younger voice, Michael's voice. He thanked me for coming home, said he'd been so scared waiting alone. Then his voice shifted back to normal, explaining that Michael understood now why the family couldn't come. They were too influenced by the outside world, but that was okay. He and Michael would complete the ritual together. I tried reasoning with him, explaining that Mom and Emma were worried, that we all loved him and wanted to help. Dad laughed, not cruelly, but with genuine warmth. He said he knew we loved him, and he loved us too. That's why he was doing this, to keep his promise, to make sure Michael was never abandoned again. The math was simple, he explained. 18 hours every year for 30 years. That was 540 hours he'd given Michael, but it wasn't enough, would never be enough. Michael had spent his last hours keeping Timothy calm, telling him stories, dying slowly in the dark so his brother could live. The debt could never be repaid, unless. Dad held up a key, the one to his ankle chain. He explained that he'd wait the full 18 hours, like always. But this time, when it ended, he had a choice. Unlock the chain and continue the cycle next year, or drop the key down the old heating grate where no one could reach it. Stay with Michael forever. Finally balance the scales. I begged him to come upstairs, to talk to Dr. Chen, to try medication or therapy or anything else. Dad's response chilled me. He said he'd already tried therapy years ago when I was young. The therapist had wanted him to let Michael go, to process his grief. But letting go meant breaking his promise. It meant leaving a 6-year-old boy alone in the dark forever. So he'd stopped going. Told Mom the therapist said he was fine. And for a while, the ritual had been enough. 18 hours a year to honor his brother, to keep his promise. But lately, Michael's voice had been getting louder, the guilt heavier, the counting constant. Dad looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment I saw the father I remembered from childhood, the one who taught me to ride a bike and cheered at my soccer games. He asked me to tell Emma he was sorry for scaring her, to tell Mom he loved her, to remember the good times, not this. Then he turned back to his circle and resumed counting. I ran, up the stairs, out of the house, into the car where Emma waited. She took one look at my face and drove, not asking questions until we were miles away. When I finally explained what I'd seen, she pulled over and we both sobbed. We called emergency services again, reporting the chain, the gasoline, the propane. This time they took it seriously. Fire department, police, paramedics, all racing toward our childhood home. Emma and I followed at a distance, afraid to hope. By the time we arrived, the scene was chaos. Emergency vehicles blocked the street. Neighbors stood on their lawns watching. Mom had arrived somehow, standing with Jake's parents near the police tape. Her face was blank with shock. A firefighter emerged from the house and spoke with the incident commander. Even from where we stood, we could see the frustration in their body language. Emma and I pushed closer, trying to hear. Dad had barricaded the basement door from the inside. Not aggressively. He'd simply wedged it shut and explained calmly that he was observing a family tradition and would appreciate privacy. He assured them he meant no harm to anyone, including himself. He just needed 18 hours. When they mentioned the gasoline, he laughed and said it was for the generator in case the power went out. The propane heater, the basement got cold, the chain around his ankle, a personal choice to ensure he honored his commitment. He had the key. He'd unlock it when the time was up. Everything was fine. The incident commander was in an impossible position. Dad sounded rational. He wasn't threatening anyone. He claimed the gasoline was stored safely. The propane heater was up to code, without clear evidence of immediate danger. Forcing entry could escalate a stable situation. They decided to wait, monitor the situation, try to establish dialogue. A negotiator arrived and spent 3 hours attempting to engage Dad through the door. Dad responded politely but firmly. He was fine. His family was overreacting. He'd come out when the 18 hours were complete. As afternoon faded to evening, our family stood vigil in Jake's parents' yard. Emma clung to Mom, both of them exhausted from fear and grief. I watched the house, counting the hours like Dad had taught us. 6 o'clock came and went, the official start of foundation day. Around 8, smoke began seeping from the basement windows. The firefighters rushed in, axes breaking down the door Dad had so carefully wedged shut. Smoke poured out, thick and black. We could hear shouting, the crash of equipment, the hiss of water meeting flames. They brought Dad out on a stretcher, unconscious but breathing, overcome by smoke inhalation. The propane heater had malfunctioned, though whether by accident or design, no one could say. The fire had spread to the stored gasoline, creating a toxic cloud that would have culled him if firefighters hadn't broken through. At the hospital, Dad drifted in and out of consciousness for days. When he finally woke fully, he seemed confused. He asked for Michael, then caught himself, asked for Mom instead. The doctors explained that oxygen deprivation could affect memory, personality, behavior. Only time would tell what damage had been done, but something had shifted. The certainty was gone from Dad's eyes. He looked at us like he was seeing clearly for the first time in years. When Emma tentatively took his hand, he squeezed back and whispered an apology that broke our hearts. The psychiatric evaluation was mandatory after the incident. Dr. Chen consulted with a hospital psychiatrist, sharing our documentation, the videos, the 30-year pattern. Dad didn't fight it. He sat through the sessions, answered questions, submitted to tests. The diagnosis was complex. PTSD, complicated grief, dissociative episodes triggered by survivor guilt. Treatment would be long, intensive therapy, medication trials, possibly inpatient care. Dad agreed to all of it with the exhaustion that suggested the fight had finally gone out of him, or perhaps Michael's voice had finally gone quiet. The house was uninhabitable. Smoke and water damage had destroyed the basement and first floor. Mom stayed with Jake's parents while insurance sorted things out. Emma went back to her apartment but called Mom every night. I returned to work, deflecting concerned questions from coworkers who'd heard various versions of the story. 6 months later, Dad was stable enough for supervised visits. We met at a neutral location, a therapist's office designed for family sessions. Dad looked older, but clearer, like fog had lifted from his features. He spoke carefully, acknowledging the pain he'd caused while avoiding the spiral of guilt that had trapped him for so long. He told us about Michael, not the voice in his head, but his actual brother, a boy who loved dinosaurs and hated vegetables, who always let Timothy win at games, who sang silly songs when Timothy got scared. For the first time in 30 years, Dad was remembering Michael as he'd actually been, not as a weight of obligation and guilt. The warehouse at the collapse site, Dad admitted he'd been visiting it, but not to maintain a shrine. He'd been trying to understand why that place held such power over him. The therapist helped him realize he'd been attempting to control trauma by returning to its source, trying to master fear by facing it repeatedly. Mom filed for separation, not divorce. She loved Dad, but couldn't return to enabling his illness. She needed to heal too, to understand her own role in maintaining the toxic dynamic. They attended couples counseling separately and together, working through 3 decades of accumulated damage. Emma struggled most. She'd internalized Dad's manipulation, believed she was responsible for continuing the tradition. Her own therapy focused on breaking free from that narrative, on understanding that love didn't mean enabling enabling someone's self-destruction. As for me, I carried my own guilt. Guilt for not seeing Dad's illness sooner, for participating in the ritual all those years, for the final confrontation that nearly culled him. My therapist reminded me that children aren't responsible for their parents' trauma, that recognizing abuse doesn't mean not loving the abuser. Foundation Day came again the next year, March 22nd. Dad was in a residential treatment facility, working through exposure therapy with trained professionals. Mom was taking pottery classes, finding herself after decades of managing Dad's illness. Emma had started dating someone who knew our family history and loved her anyway. I spent the day normally, went to work, grabbed lunch with a colleague, watched a movie that evening. But at 6 o'clock, I lit a candle. Not for 18 hours, not in a basement, just a moment of acknowledgement for two boys who'd suffered an unimaginable trauma, and for the family still learning to heal from its echoes. The candle flickered in my apartment window as I thought about cycles and breaking them, about promises that bind and love that sometimes means letting go, about the difference between honoring the past and being trapped by it. I blew out the candle after a few minutes and made dinner. Life continued, imperfect but moving forward. The Marsh family tradition had finally ended, replaced by something harder but healthier, the ongoing work of recovery. Dad called that evening from the treatment center. Brief check-ins were part of his therapy. He sounded tired but present, asking about my day, sharing a small breakthrough from group session. Neither of us mentioned what day it was. We didn't need to. The date had lost its power over us, becoming just another square on the calendar. After we hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of my apartment, not counting hours or making promises to ghosts, just breathing, existing, allowing myself to be free from the basement of inherited trauma. It wasn't a dramatic ending, no neat resolution or perfect healing, just a family learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to live with their history without being defined by it. The real work was just beginning. Hi guys, this is Mini Fable Fever. If you enjoy my content, please like and subscribe for more content like this.